Hi everyone, in this video we are going to discuss the cap and trade system. So back in 1997 when Bush decided not to sign the Kyoto Protocol, he essentially said that this was not a good system for the US in order to reduce our global greenhouse gas emissions. And so essentially because that was going to cripple our US economy, and it also had a double standard for us versus developing nations, specifically China and India, we decided that we were going to try to find alternative routes to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions that would not cripple our economy. And so what one of our systems are called the cap and trade system, and it sounds really complicated, but it's actually quite straightforward. So essentially the first rule is that each company is assigned an annual level of carbon dioxide that they are allowed to actually release into the atmosphere, okay? So they are allowed a certain amount of carbon dioxide emissions. Now, number two, at the end of the year, companies that are below their limit can sell their extra CO2, and I call them credits, essentially, just to help kind of make sense a little bit here. And so if you are below your limit, so you have not released as much carbon dioxide as you are allowed to release in the atmosphere, you can actually sell your carbon dioxide credits. So on the opposite end of this, companies that have not done their part to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, so companies that exceed their limit, and I'm going to say can, but I really should say must, they must buy these extra CO2 credits from the other companies. Okay? So let's see if this makes sense. In theory, the overall emissions are, and now fill in the blank, something in the most financially beneficial method for both, and I'm just going to call them plants because they're typically power plants, but we could essentially say for both companies. Okay, complete the sentence. All right, did we get an answer? Hopefully we did, and essentially what I was looking for is that the overall emissions, so our U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, are decreased in the most financially beneficial method for both plants. So we are no longer crippling our companies and we're not making them go bankrupt. We are just making it so that as a nation we can decrease our greenhouse gas emissions without destroying our economy. And so let's talk about this in terms of an example, because sometimes that helps make this system make a little bit more sense. So essentially we have two teams. We have Team A and Team B. And let's say we are in a weight loss competition and we're trying to lose a total of 30% of our weight. So let's pretend these are retired sumo wrestlers, because otherwise 30% of weight loss would be just way too much weight to think about. Okay, so on the first day, you weigh in with some number, just whatever. They each have a number, and then we come in at the end of the year and we're re-weighing them to see how much weight they've lost in the entire year. Well, for Team A, we see that they have gone down by 35% of their original weight, whereas Team B has gone down 25% of their original weight. Well, we know the goal is for each of them to decrease by 30%. And since Team A actually way surpassed their goal, they went over it by 5%, what they can then do is sell 5% of their weight, or in terms of cap and trade, 5% of their CO2 emissions to Team B, so that on average, okay, or overall, they're each at a net loss of 30%. So we can talk about this with weight, or we can talk about it with CO2 emissions, but essentially all we are doing is making it so that overall we are decreased by whatever percentages that the government has set. So let's just say, for example, 30%. Both companies have decreased by 30% total, but neither one of them have had huge financial problems where they're going to just destroy their company and make them go bankrupt, essentially. All right, so what is the big setback of this? Unfortunately, this is going to cause volatile emission permits. And what that really means is that's going to drive up consumer costs. And so it's very difficult for them to predict exactly what their CO2 emissions are going to be month by month. And so at the very end of the year, it is very possible that they've either gone over or under, and we're going to have to end up charging the consumer in order to make up for those cost differences. So we will see an increase in our consumer market. The opposite of this would be if we did something called a carbon tax. So a carbon tax would no longer use a cap and trade system. A carbon tax essentially just charges polluters a certain amount of money based on the total amount of carbon that they are releasing into the atmosphere. So the last number I read was that they would charge about $23 for every ton of carbon. It's just straight up carbon, not carbon dioxide, released into the atmosphere. So you have to release it into the atmosphere. If you sequester the carbon dioxide and pump it down in the ground, that doesn't count. We're just talking about CO2 released in the atmosphere. So just to remind you, a ton of carbon is 1,000 kilograms, which is really 1 million grams of carbon release, which is a lot, and they're only going to charge $23 for that. So hopefully I've shown you a couple different ways that the U.S. is trying to get our emissions down, but we're still not there yet. We still need to keep moving forward. Good luck, guys. Take care of yourself. Drink water.